Ever feel like Portugal just gets put in that category of pretty beaches and delicious food in your mental travel guide,
You
you
do?
know?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
But we're about to totally change that up today. Today we're doing a deep dive into the absolutely wild history of Portugal. And believe me, there's so much more to it than just like a charming little side note in your European history book.
Oh, absolutely. Portugal's story, it's packed with all these, like, global power struggles and crazy twists of fate,
I'm telling you.
like cultural clashes. It's like a soap opera,
Yes, but
seriously.
get this, we're talking about a timeline that goes back 200,000 years.
Wow.
200,000. It's incredible. So, to kind of wrap our heads around this epic saga, we've got these excerpts from two awesome books. We've got one that's kind of geared toward, well, history nerds like us.
Right.
But then we've got this other one that's more academic. It really digs into the nitty-gritty for like a more worldwide audience.
It's really interesting, though, how those different perspectives, they actually work together.
Yeah.
It gives us this, like, way more complete picture of how Portugal got to be Portugal, with all the geography and the culture,
It's wild.
and honestly, just like luck,
Totally.
all playing a part.
Okay, so before we even get to the whole Portugal with a capital P, we've got to rewind way back.
Okay.
Back to a time when, like, Romans ruled the Mediterranean, right?
Right.
This is where we run into this word Lusitania. And honestly, I always thought it sounded like something out of a fantasy novel.
It does. It's like something Tolkien would come up with, right?
Right.
Like, oh, the land of Lusitania.
Exactly. But Lusitania was a real deal. I mean, it was the Roman name for what we now call Portugal.
Yeah.
So, okay, it's a cool name, but like, what's the big deal about this Roman influence? Was it just like a blip on the radar, or did it actually stick?
Oh, no. It was way more than a blip. I mean, think about it. The Roman conquest, that's what brought Latin to the region. And
Yeah.
that became the foundation for modern Portuguese. The Romans brought their legal systems, their architecture. Really, it's like they laid the groundwork for Portuguese society as we know it today.
Wow.
Even if, it wasn't always a smooth transition, it's still, we're talking massive cultural shift, like almost hitting reset on their world.
That's incredible to think about how those Roman influences, we can still see them today. Like the ruins, obviously, but also the language, even some of the food, probably.
Oh, absolutely. But one thing that's important to remember is that this whole Romanization thing, that's what historians call it, wasn't exactly a welcome party everywhere.
Oh, interesting.
Our sources talk about some pretty fierce resistance, especially up north. People were holding on to their traditional ways of life, and they had these fortified settlements called castros.
Cascrows! See, now that sounds like something straight out of Game of Thrones.
Right.
Those ancient hilltop forts. You've got to wonder if George R.R. Martin stumbled upon those in his research and was like, yep, that's going in the books.
I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Right.
And speaking of power struggles and who's in charge of what territory, the Roman period kind of blends into this other really important chapter, the Reconquista. And this is where things get a little messy,
Yeah.
because those textbook stories about the good guys and the bad guys, it wasn't really that simple.
Okay, so Reconquista, it literally means reconquest, right?
Yeah, okay.
So we're talking about those Christian efforts to, take back the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors.
That's the basic idea.
Right.
But our sources, they really stress that it wasn't just like one religion versus another.
Right.
We're talking centuries of alliances shifting, power grabs, cultural exchange happening all over the place.
Wow.
I mean, for instance, the Moors, they'd conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula by the 8th century. But they weren't just invaders. They brought all this advanced knowledge with them, like mathematics, astronomy, agriculture. Their presence really left a mark on the region.
So it's less about, this taking back and more about this kind of, I don't know, intertwined history, right? They're all kind of mixed up together.
Yeah, exactly. It's messy. And in the middle of all that, you have Portugal emerging as its own independent kingdom.
Right.
And it all kind of comes down to this really crucial battle in 1128, the Battle of Samamede.
Samamede, that's where Afonso Henriques shows up, right?
He does.
Portugal's first king.
Yeah, but here's a fun fact for you. He wasn't fighting the Moors at Samamede. He was fighting his own mother.
He was, hold on. Okay. That is the kind of detail they leave out of the history books.
Right.
That's some serious family drama. What was the deal with that? Why were they fighting?
Well, Afonso's mother, Teresa, she favored her illegitimate children. And she really wanted to hold on to the county of Portugal. And, Afonso, he wasn't cool with being pushed aside, so he decided to take charge of the situation.
Wow.
The Battle of Sama Made, it was basically his declaration of independence. And spoiler alert, he won.
That's intense. So Sama made, that's like the Big Bang of Portugal?
Yeah, you could say that.
And then the Treaty of Zamora in 1143, that's like, okay, it's official. Portugal's on the map.
Exactly.
Ready to make its mark.
And make its mark it did. Over the next few centuries, you see this small, kind of scrappy kingdom turning into this global powerhouse.
It's true.
And a lot of that is thanks to, everyone's favorite time period, the Age of Exploration.
Yeah.
We're talking Prince Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, ships loaded down with spices from the east.
Okay, but that does sound super romantic, like very adventurous. But our sources, they do mention that Prince Henry, he wasn't quite the hero everyone makes him out to be.
Yeah, it seems like he got a bit of a historical PR boost somewhere along the way.
Like, exaggerated.
A little bit. He's always portrayed as this, fearless explorer, charting new waters and all that. But the reality is, he almost never actually went on the voyages himself.
Oh, really?
He was more like a sponsor,
Interesting.
supporting the expeditions, but from a distance.
So, more of an ideas guy.
Exactly. But he did get the ball rolling for something pretty incredible.
He did. Vasco da Gama's trip to India in 1498, that was huge, right?
Huge.
I mean, talk about a turning point in history. It opened up a whole new route to Asia by sea.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it brought a ton of wealth and power to Portugal. But, and this is where those less glamorous sides of the story come in.
Right?
This is also when you see the slave trade really start to take off. With Portugal, unfortunately, playing a pretty big role in that.
It's true.
And then there were the forced conversions of Jews during King Manuel I's reign.
Right.
That's a really dark chapter,
Yeah.
fueled by religious intolerance. Our sources really emphasize how those events cast a pretty long shadow over Portugal's so-called Golden Age.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history is never just one thing, right? For every triumph, there are going to be shadows.
Exactly.
And speaking of shadows, the 18th century throws a pretty big one over Portugal, literally.
Yeah.
The Lisbon earthquake of 1755.
Oh, man. That's got to be one of those events that just shakes you to the core, It's one of those things where, you can't even really wrap your head around it. A massive earthquake that pretty much leveled Lisbon.
Yeah, and it sent shockwaves, literally across Europe.
Crazy.
But, the impact of it went way beyond just the physical destruction. Imagine a whole society. They've just lost their capital city, right, which was a symbol of, all their success, their power.
Right.
And then in a blink, it's rubble.
Gone.
It really makes you think about how fragile everything is,
Totally. And then out of that tragedy, you have Marquis de Pombal stepping in. He's the one who gets the job of rebuilding Lisbon, is that right?
That's right. And Pombal, he was this really fascinating guy, a real mix of contradictions. He's an Enlightenment man, embraces reason and progress. Okay.
But he also ruled with an iron fist.
Wow.
So, he's putting all these sweeping reforms in place, modernizing the infrastructure.
Yeah.
He even redesigned parts of Lisbon.
So he was kind of like a benevolent dictator then, or is that putting it too simply?
Maybe not. I mean, on the one hand, he did do a lot of good, right? Secularized education, promoted commerce.
Right.
But he could be ruthless.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Suppressing anyone who disagreed with him, consolidating his own power. Our sources, they don't hold back, They paint a very complex picture of what he did.
I bet. It's amazing how one person can have such a complicated impact,
It really is.
So, Pombal aside, Portugal in the 19th and 20th centuries, it seems like things really sped up. Revolutions, economic struggles.
Yeah.
They even were a republic for a bit, right?
Briefly, yeah. It was a wild ride for sure. And then, of course, you have the dictatorship.
Right. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar and that whole Estado Novo regime, that's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
What's interesting to me is that Salazar didn't really fit the mold of those other dictators. He wasn't a Hitler or a Mussolini.
Very different. You're right. Salazar's dictatorship, it was a lot more about control behind the scenes. Bureaucratic control, keeping the economy stable. He wasn't so much about grand visions or conquering territory.
Interesting.
He was actually an economist, by training.
Yeah.
And he really exerted his power through careful financial management and this, network of surveillance. It was a very different approach.
So it was more like, keep your head down, do your job, and everything will be fine. That kind of vibe.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how Salazar, even though he was authoritarian, his regime, it was so different to the fascist ones at the time.
Right.
And it's interesting, during World War II, he kept Portugal neutral.
Oh, really?
which, thinking about it, might have been a really smart move to make sure they survived.
Wow. See, that's what I mean about needing a whole separate deep dive on this guy.
It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. But I guess even the dictatorships that seem the strongest, they don't last forever.
Nope.
For Portugal, that change came with the Carnation Revolution, 1974.
What a moment.
Talk about a breath of fresh air, a revolution without bloodshed, bringing back democracy.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It was a huge turning point for Portugal.
Yep.
It ushered in this whole new era: openness, modernization, joining the rest of Europe. It was only a few years later, in 1986, that Portugal joined the European Union, which I imagine has had a pretty massive impact.
Totally. I mean, hello. It means we can use euros on our next trip to Lisbon.
Exact.
But in all seriousness, it's incredible when you look at everything Portugal has gone through. Invasions, natural disasters, political upheaval.
Economic crises, too.
You name it, they've weathered it. And they've come out the other side, this vibrant democracy, with this rich culture, fascinating history.
You know, that resilience, that ability to adapt and kind of reinvent themselves, it's a recurring theme in their story. It's something
Yeah.
that really struck me reading these sources. They just never give up.
There's a lesson in there somewhere, for sure. One of the things that really stuck with me was learning about Vasco da Gama. This guy, he basically changed the world with that voyage to India,
Hey.
but he wasn't some highborn prince.
Right.
He was just the son of some, like, local official. And it makes you think, even back then, there were ways to move up in the world, to make something of yourself no matter where you came from.
That's such a good point.
Mhm.
It makes you wonder how much that adventurous spirit, that willingness to jump into the unknown, how much that still influences Portugal today, you
Yeah.
know? You see it in their art, their music, their literature. There's this openness to new experiences, this blend of all these different influences,
Mhm.
and it's what makes Portugal so unique.
It's true. It's like they've taken all these different parts of their past, the good, the bad, the difficult parts, all of it, and they've woven them together into something really special.
It's quite an achievement. And that brings us to our final thought for you as you're listening, something to consider as you continue to explore Portugal on your own. What can we learn from this small nation, this nation that has seen so much exploration, religious persecution, political change? What can they teach us today as we navigate this complicated world? What wisdom can we glean from everything they've gone through?